In this last section of the course, we're going to study just a little bit of statistics, but just enough to wet your whistle, but not enough to make you an expert. But let's talk about what is a statistic. A statistic is actually a measurement that can be used to analyze data. Now, a statistic from a sample can be used to infer certain information about the population. So, for instance, maybe you wanted to measure the average age of a certain population, and you don't want to measure every person or every element in the population, so you just take a sample and then you measure find the average age of that sample, and then you use that average to infer information about the average age of the population. So we really have two types of statistics. We have population statistics, and generally you don't know the population statistics because one of the main emphasis of statistics is to take samples in order to try to estimate the population statistics. But some common population statistics we're going to talk about here is the mean. This is the population mean using the Greek letter mu. The population variance, which uses the Greek letter sigma squared, and the population standard deviation, which uses the Greek letter sigma. And then for sample statistics, the sample mean uses the letter x with a bar over it. Variance uses s squared, and standard deviation uses s. So you can see that the variance and standard deviation of the sample looks similar to the variance and standard deviation of the population, except for the type of letters they use. And then some less common statistics that we'll talk about are the median, mode, and range. Now, there's two areas of statistics that are important. One is the area dealing with central tendency, and the other is the area dealing with dispersion. Central tendency is basically a way to determine what your data that you gather is centered about, and then dispersion is a way to determine how that information is spread about that center. So we're going to talk about three measures of centrality or central tendency. The most common used is the mean, and most students are familiar with a mean because all a mean is an average. So anytime you average a set of test scores, you're actually calculating the mean. Median is the middle score. So I like to remind you of a median in a roadway to help you remember this one, because the median in a roadway is in the middle of the road. So the median of a set of data is the middle score of that data. And then the mode, this measure has some uses, but it's a little different from the other two. The mode is the value that occurs the most. And one of the ways I help students remember that is I'll use the word most instead of most. So just think that the mode is the value that occurs the most. And so usually if there is a mode, there might be one mode. Sometimes you can have more than one mode, and in that case we call it, say it's bimodal, but I'll show you an example of a bimodal one later. Okay, now the reason that centrality is not the only thing we talk about is it doesn't tell us everything we know about our data distribution, because we also need to know how it's spread out. For example, let's consider a student. Let's say that student A has an exam average of 80, and the test scores are 77, 82, 83, and 78. Now you might notice that these test scores are fairly close to the average 80. But student B could still have an average of 80, but that student's test scores could be 60, 100, 65, and 95. Now those test scores are actually far from the mean of 80. So this set of test scores would be spread out farther than the first set of test scores. Okay, so the three measures of dispersion we'll talk about. One is a range, and the range is a very trivial statistic. All you have to do is take the difference of the high value minus the low value to get the range of a set of data. Now the variance is a measure of the variation, and so it describes how the data is distributed about the mean. And actually the standard deviation is also a measure of the variance, but we actually have to take the square root of the variance to get the standard deviation. So if you can get the variance, then getting the standard deviation is very simple. All you have to do is hit the square root key on your calculator. Now, when you're getting raw data is just a set of scores that have not been grouped into any categories. And so that's what raw data is. But group data is where you have categories, or they're actually called class intervals. And so you just record how many elements fall into each class interval. So I'll show you some examples involving raw data and some examples involving group data. Now let's go ahead and shut this video down right here as far as the introduction of statistics, and we'll look at, in the next video, we'll go ahead and start with measures of central tendency.